Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine.
Good.
Ready and raring to go.
Of course.
Sort out all the problems. And there's still a problem with the Iranian government and the Iranian people and the American government.
Yes.
But I would narrow it down for the American people to the people who are the neocons, they're the ones that bother me the most. But there's a lot going on, and there's been articles out today about escalation, because today's the date they might get up to the level where they reach how much uranium they can store.
Yeah.
And that's an issue. But then there's going to be a meeting with Putin and Trump, and I'm sure they'll be talking about this issue. And then there's also been this threat that the Europeans ought to clean up their act and help the Iranians. And they've picked a date that by July 7th, they better do something, because they will probably go ahead and increase the enrichment, not only the stockpiling, the amount, but enriching the uranium, which, sort of sounds terrible, but they're still years away from a bomb. I don't believe for a minute that's in their plan, but they have to play this game. But I think the game, which is a lot more serious than a game, I think it's more like a game of chicken. But I put the escalation, the beginning of it, unfortunately, it's our own government that I find greatest fault with. And if we just leave these things alone, we wouldn't have to deal with this, but we have to. And I think the significant escalation occurred a year ago when Trump got out of the treaty, the nuclear agreement, and it's been going on, and now it's boiling over, and with these several things going on, and there's a vote probably tomorrow in the Senate that said that Trump can't start a war without coming to the Congress. And boy, I'll tell you what, you can hear the noise now already. That is not true. He can do anything he wants because he has this right to defend the country if there's an imminent threat. And they're putting this in that category, that going to these mini wars, when there's immediate imminent threat, they're allowed to do this, which is concocted and stretched. But I think when it comes to getting out of the treaty and adding sanctions and lying about drones, does nothing good for the world, nothing good for the United States, and certainly puts Iran in a box. And they're enough of a problem to deal with because they do have a different system. But compared to what? I made a statement yesterday that got some attention that they're probably could be much easier to get along with than Saudi Arabia if you were looking at civil liberties and aggression. Here we're best buddies with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Good for jobs, the president tells us. We get to sell them weapons, which is a shame. So yes, there is escalation. I'm for de-escalation. I wished I could wave a wand and do something about it. But the best we can do is try to explain the situation and try to get more people to move in our direction.
But Dr. Paul, Pompeo said the other day that we've done everything possible to de-escalate. So how can you not believe your Secretary of State?
Yeah.
But the Iranians are sitting here wondering what's in it for us. We hammered out this deal. We were abiding by the deal. We're still abiding by the deal. The U.S. unilaterally pulls out of the deal, and not only does that, but adds sanctions back on and strangles us again, which is the whole purpose of the deal. The Europeans are so mealy-mouthed, they're so spineless, they're not doing anything to give them relief. So they're suffering just as much as they were before the deal, and yet the rest of the world saying, you better stay in that deal. What kind of deal is that?
I've mentioned to you earlier, this is not directly related to what we're doing, but indirectly, Trump is not too happy with India because India put some tariffs on us. And it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, and that's a different issue. But he's saying, don't do that. You have no right to do this, and we want you to stop, and we want you to remove these tariffs. I get to thinking, what does he think these other countries, how many countries have we put sanctions on? And how many people have suffered from our sanctions? And certainly this is the case for Iran. They're suffering terribly much. And we've talked about it so much, I think it's an immoral act, and it is an act of war. And and it's escalation, deliberate escalation, and non-interventionism would have prevented this from even being an issue. And most people would say yes, and the world would be owned by the Iranians. They would own everything. Oh, sure, they would. You know,
We'd be speaking Farsi.
That's not, and it would not have happened.
And so, you know, this show's kind of like putting some things together that are coming to a head, really.
Right.
And so the Friday vote you mentioned is Leader McConnell changed his mind, allowed a vote, telling the president you can't use any money that we're appropriating here or authorizing. It's the NDAA. You can't use any money we're authorizing for war against Iran unless you come to us for authorization, which is pretty uncontroversial. And this is the Udall amendment, and I think there are plenty of others. I think our good friend from Kentucky is on it as well, and others. But there are loopholes in this bill. This isn't like something that your hands are tied. And I think one of the biggest loopholes, you could probably drive a B-52 through it, is that if the U.S. troops are threatened or attacked or in danger, and so we put all our troops on Iran's border, and of course are in danger all the time, just as the Iranian troops be if they're on our border. But nevertheless, it's still good that they're having a vote. I think McConnell realizes that they're not going to get the numbers that they need to attach that vote to the National Defense Authorization Act. I think they need more than they can get unless something strange happens. But still, I would still count it as a symbolic victory for our side.
Now, that comes tomorrow, but there may be some news today because the Iranians might reach that particular limit where they would go over it. I don't think at 6 o'clock tonight there will be an announcement that there's 2 pounds over and it just happened. But it is the day at that point where there may be a turning point where excesses are there and they can't, and there's technically, breaking the agreement, which has already been broken. But what's ironic is this excesses of the uranium that they have in storage, they could sell it and export it and have, except the sanctions won't allow them, but it's still the Iranians' fault.
It still
we put the sanctions on, and then they can't export the things that we said, you better export them and you better not do it. It's, but I think the bottom line, it's not the smartest thing for us to do to try to sort the details out and say, well, if they do this and this, because they're obsessed. They're obsessed with regime change. And the administration is full of those individuals. And at times we hope that Trump is less aggressive. Like the other day, he refused to drop the bombs on them. But there is no doubt in my mind that the people he worked with are there to protect a position that he holds, and that is to finally get a regime change in Iran. And that's, the coalition that we're aligned with in the Middle East, as Saudi Arabia and Israel and all this group. That's their goal. So this is the details going on, but ultimately, like you say, Pompeo has already admitted they have done everything conceivable to de-escalate, and they won't de-escalate. It always reminds me that the bad guys are always for peace on their terms.
On their terms. And one thing that you won't hear in the U.S. media are the details, and it's not that complicated. I think Americans can understand it. But if Iran does breach those limits, stockpile limits, it's still within its rights to do so, because built into the Iran deal, Articles 26 and 36, that if the other signatories break this agreement and start adding sanctions onto Iran, then Iran reserves the authority to do this. And that's exactly what happened. It's justified. It's a political rather than a legal decision that the Iranians have to make, and I think they're making it for political reasons to say, hey, why are we sitting here letting everyone throw rocks at us? But the American media won't explain that simple thing to the American people.
Well, there's been an idea floating around, which I don't think is likely to occur at all, and that is that we take it to the United Nations. All of a sudden, we're going to go to the UN and take it to the Security Council and have a declaration of breach of the peace by the Iranians, and therefore it would justify a military attack. But that's not likely to happen because the resolution could be vetoed. But it's still sort of in the news. Well, the United Nations could do this, and they're in the bridge of peace, and we're going to have the moral justification for doing what we plan to do anyway. So it's just, to me, it's a matter of time. Now, the other day when Trump canceled the bombing, but he has made statements that if they do this, if they breach this and go over the limits, they're going to know about it. I mean, those threats were pretty powerful quotes. It'll be obliteration. He didn't say what he's going to obliterate. I hope it's not quite as big as it could be if they really wanted to.
Yeah, the issue really, I think, is how the media is going to play this, and I think we can guess how it's going to be. They're going to take the exceeding the stockpiles, and maybe they'll wait until July 7th if there's no European deal, and I doubt there will be, although the Russians are trying to urge the Europeans to get this thing in place so they can start trading more. But at that point, it's going to be starting to be sold to the American people that the Iranians are working on a bomb again. And you can already feel that. Here's a piece in today's AP, which I like to call absolute propaganda. But here's a quote, and listen how this is a scare tactic. As Iran prepares to surpass limits set by its 2015 nuclear deal with world powers, each step it takes narrows the time the country's leaders would need to have enough highly enriched uranium for an atomic bomb. Scary. And then the next sentence, if they choose to build one, which they haven't done. They don't have a nuclear weapons program. In 2007, the CIA determined that they don't. There's been routine inspections by the IAEA since that. As late as 2012, the CIA said there's no nuclear weapons program. By all accounts, they stopped their program in 2003. So even if they started enriching it to the limits, beyond the limits, there is no nuclear weapons program.
I wonder why so few people see the irony that, we left, a year ago we left, we got out of the Accords, and yet we're in a daily operation and activity of forever dictating what we don't like about it and what they're going to do, and this is what they have to do. When we leave, maybe they're legitimate. I say you leave, but you don't retain the right unless you have a lot of armed might behind you, and this is what really plays badly, in the world, because I just think this is adding fuel to the fire of anti-Americanism, which I think is growing by leaps and bounds. And with this escalation here and something really getting out of hand, this is going to get much bigger. And then you're going to see maybe a lot more interest in India and China and Russia and coming up with something alternative in the media. Isn't it amazing that we have the control of SWIFT? If we're going to punish the Ayatollah, which I think was. It didn't amount to as much as it did was an insult to their religious leader. And we said, okay, Mr. Husseini, the Ayatollah, say you can't use that, and they put a sanction on him. So that has to aggravate a lot of people, throughout the world, and say, why are they doing this? And I think that it's fuel to the fire of anti-Americanism that's building, and it's not because we're better than everybody else. It's because we get involved in too many things that we don't have a right to do.
Exactly, and I think that the third thing, and we touched on it earlier, is this expected Trump-Putin meeting in the weekend of the G20 summit in Japan, and this is it's an important head-to-head meeting between the two. It brings up the wild cards like Bolton if he's going to be running around trying to stir up trouble. But this comes at a time where the Russians, I think, are definitely stepping in. And I think we put a piece up on the Ron Paul Institute website drawing some parallels between what's happening now with the U.S. and Iran and with what happened with the U.S. and Syria, where the Russians stepped in at the pivotal moment and said, listen, we've got to do something to stop this, or even create a fait accompli on the ground. We have a statement yesterday from the Russian Foreign Ministry that's uncharacteristically pointed. If we can put it up and scroll down a little, this last paragraph is pretty unusual. They're usually not this straightforward and pointed. Russia stands in full solidarity with the friendly people of Iran and its government. The U.S. government should consider where such a reckless course of action might lead. Not only could it destabilize the Middle East, it threatens to undermine the entire system of international security. We also had a statement from a senior Russian diplomat, the Russian diplomat in charge of that part of the world for their foreign ministry, and said, quote, Iran will withstand this type of fight, and Iran is not alone. So there's pushback now. They're trying to establish pressure, I think. The question is what will happen at the Trump-Putin summit, or meeting on the side of the summit.
And that may be this weekend coming up. But you know, the other thing that we shouldn't fail to mention once again is that the inspectors who were assigned, you know, to check and see if the Iranians are living up to their promises of the treaty. And they've never been found in violation. And yet they still get painted as on the verge of having an atomic weapon, you know, in no time at all. And therefore we have to prepare for that to be taken care of. And there's, you know, now several countries that say, if they get one, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go in there and bomb it and take care of it. So that too often is forgotten. Matter of fact, the media is so pro-war, which is so disgusting. You know, that the other side of the issue, there's so few reporters now, journalists. In the old days, there's a couple still around, but they're not going to get on the average news of the major stations.
That's true, and you know, this is a really good point, because you remember when we had Scott Ritter, the former chief UN weapons inspector for Iraq, speaking at the Ron Paul Institute conference, and he makes a good point, because what the neocons say about this, well, IAEA said that they're not working on it, and the neocons would say, well, that's because they're not going to all the places they need to go to. And remember what Scott Ritter, he said, the whole point of this inspections for the neocons is to force noncompliance on the part of, at that time, Iraq, but now it's Iran. You push, push, push. We need to go into Rouhani's bedroom. We need to, you know, push, push, push until they say, hey, hold on, that's enough. You're not going to go here. Then you trigger it. And that's exactly what they're doing with this.
Right, and this hope that things change. I do think, though, that the vote tomorrow is a good idea, a good thing, and maybe it'll help move people in the right direction. I hope there's a long debate on it, and I hope people pay attention to it, because I don't think this subject was well debated in last night's Democratic debates. They're not going to get into this right now. I didn't watch debates, so I can't say much about it. But I tell you what, the statement by Tulsi, it was good. She stuck to her guns on the foreign policy, but no, that whole audience, you know, the whole group, probably out of those 20, she might be the only one that comes up sensibly on foreign policy. Yeah. But they're the progressive. Here they're out bragging, out trying to out progressive one another, and they won't even look at foreign policy. They have fallen in trap. They might as well be neocons. Yeah. And of course, we've complained about that. Democrats get in charge of the White House and foreign policy, and they do the same thing, sometimes worse.
And it's interesting that you bring up the debate. I didn't watch it either, but I watched some clips, especially of Tulsi. The only one I could stomach was really fascinating. We talked about this before the show, is that, I don't know, someone put it up, the most searched candidates' names before and after the debate. Before, Tulsi didn't even show up on the map. It was all a different color. Then after, it was all green. It reminds me of somebody else who, I think they used to say, Google Ron Paul. It's the exact same thing, and I was looking at a CNN scorecard this morning. How did the candidates do in the debates? Winners and losers. You go through the whole thing, and her name was not even mentioned once. So here we go. History repeats itself. The media doesn't want the anti-war candidate.
Well, this is a little bit entertaining, and I'm not being a crybaby about this, but I'm pointing out that sometimes I would come in second in a major debate, and it'd go from 1 to 3. Yeah. It's like, oh, we don't even know who he is, you know.
Some guy.
Except a lot of people are paying attention. Ideas have consequences, and they're more powerful than the politicians, and the politicians get exposed, and this whole mess over here is going to be exposed because it's not based on good ideas, it's based on bad ideas. So this whole deal with Iran and our aggression over there is not going to work. It'll end. Our whole policy will end. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. policy with Iran is to create a crisis, and they keep trying to do it. Interestingly enough, even the UAE now is questioning the U.S. claims that it was Iran behind the tanker attacks. The UAE is a prime with the Saudi Arabians, is prime in favor of regime change in Iran. So even they are backing down a little bit. The policy is to create a crisis. My prediction, and I don't have to be a genius to think this, these two things coming together with increasing the stockpile and increasing the level of enrichment in July, if Iran chooses to pursue these, will be sold to the American people through a very compliant media as, aha, the Iranians are on the road to a bomb. See, we never should have entered into that agreement in the first place. Now it's time to attack. And that will be a disaster.
And you know, thinking about that, that's very likely to happen, but what they have to do is balance that with their hatred, the media's hatred toward Trump, because if they go too far, they might still sound like they're agreeing with Trump. But no, I agree with what's going to happen. There will be and you know, there's certain times when they will come together. You know, if they had to, the NDAA, the authorization for the military, they've come together, even though, you know, oh, this might look like a victory for Trump. So on the big issues, you know, they do come together. So that's a very likely thing to happen, and we'll certainly try to keep an eye on this. But once again, I think the consequences that we're seeing in the Middle East with dealing with Iran all has to do with a deeply flawed foreign policy, and they're tinkering on the edges with tactical things and issues, and the consequences. And that doesn't work. It has to be more strategic. It has to be philosophic. We have to ask questions on what is the proper role of our government, domestically and internationally. That's what happened prior to our revolution. They didn't like the role of government, the British government, and they did something about it. But today, we just accept what we have, and we're not asking that question. What should the role of government be? And they say, well, what we need to do is keep doing what we're doing, but what we need to do is clean up the waste and fraud. Well, government is wasteful and fraudulent, and when they steal our money, it's fraudulent and theft. So that isn't the waste and fraud. It happens, and we should try to clean it up. But that has nothing to do with the solution. The solution is only going to come philosophically when we, as a country, decide that we ought to mind our own business, protect our country, protect our liberties, and things would be a lot better for us, and it would be a lot better for the world. And if we're very successful in doing this, maybe somebody else would like to try our method. They used to think about that. Follow America. Look at America. They're free and they have prosperity. But now we have a system which was predictable by the Austrian economists, and we're seeing it right now. It's part of the debate going on right now in the presidential races, the wiping out of the middle class. And they're saying, well, it's a lack of socialism. And boy, that is a big philosophic issue, and that is a consequence of what we're putting up with and not asking the key question, what should the role of government be in a free society? Our big problem is some people don't even know what a free society is all about, and they're not too interested in it. But once they see the collapse of what we have and see Zimbabwe or Venezuela come, maybe somebody will come around and ask these questions. My goal is to ask the question now. Ask this question 10 years ago or further back. But eventually the question has to be asked, and we will have to make a decision because this country is bankrupt. It's bankrupt philosophically, morally, and financially. So something has to be done. And I do believe the answers can be found in the guidance that our founders gave us, and it can be guided by the principles of individual liberty and a moral approach to government. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.